In the ruthless geometry of the Cold War, there was no room for a man like Alexander Dubček. He was a political anomaly, a true believer who thought he could save communism from itself, a loyal son who genuinely loved the Soviet Union right up until the moment it crushed him. His tragedy was not that he fought the system, but that he trusted it too much, failing to realize that a regime built on fear views a smile not as a gesture of friendship, but as a threat to its existence. This blindness to the nature of power is exactly what leaves him sitting defenseless at the head of the Central Committee table just before midnight on August 20th, 1968. In the heart of Prague, the air is thick with the stale smoke of cheap cigarettes and exhausted ambition as Dubček debates the tedious minutiae of party statutes, completely unaware that the deadline for his naivety has finally arrived. At 11:40 p.m., the phone screams. It is the sound of history crashing into the room. The Minister of Defense delivers the impossible news. The armies have crossed the borders. 500,000 soldiers, 6,000 tanks, a steel tsunami rolling in from the dark, crushing a nation that is essentially asleep. The Soviet Empire hasn't come to negotiate. It has come to kill the dream, and they are coming for Dubček. In that frozen moment, the tragedy of an entire generation is compressed into the reaction of one man. Dubček does not scream. He simply shrinks, covering his eyes as if to shield them from a sudden blinding light. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, laced with the shattering of a lifelong faith. So they did it after all, he says to the silent room, and they did it to me. I devoted my entire life to cooperation with the Soviet Union, and they have done this to me. Long before he was a victim, Alexander Dubček was a true believer, a child raised in the harsh cradle of the Soviet experiment. In 1925, when Alexander was just a toddler, his father Stefan, a carpenter and a fervent idealist, made a decision that would define the trajectory of his son's life. Disillusioned with the economic hardships of Europe, Stefan packed up his family, his wife, young Alexander, and his brother, and moved them to the Soviet Union. They did not move to the cultural hubs of Moscow or Leningrad. They moved to Kyrgyzstan, to a cooperative called Interhelpo. It was a utopian project, a commune built in the middle of the barren steppe, where true believers from all over the world gathered to build socialism with their bare hands. Young Alexander grew up in this strange, harsh, and beautiful world. His playground was the dusty streets of a commune where Czechs, Slovaks, Russians, and Hungarians worked side by side. He did not learn about communism from dry textbooks or terrifying lectures. He learned it from the calluses on his father's hands and the communal songs sung around fires at night. He attended Soviet schools. He spoke Russian not as a foreign diplomat speaks it, but as a native with the slang and the cadence of a boy who played football in the dirt with Russian children. This is the psychological key to the tragedy. For the young Dubček, the Soviet Union was not an oppressive empire. It was home. It was the land that had given his family purpose. Even when the shadow of Stalinism began to lengthen, when the paranoia of the 1930s crept into the commune and neighbors began to disappear, the Dubček family held fast to their faith. They believed, as many did, that the system was fundamentally good, even if individual men were flawed. They rationalized the terror. They looked away. When the family returned to Slovakia in 1938, Alexander was a stranger in his own land. He was 17 years old, a young man who dreamed in Russian and looked at the world through Soviet eyes. But his loyalty was soon tested in blood. When the Second World War broke out and the Nazis occupied Europe, the Dubček family did not sit idly by. They joined the Slovak national uprising. Alexander fought in the mountains, gun in hand, against the German Wehrmacht. He was wounded twice. His brother Julius was not so lucky. He was killed in the fighting. By the time the Red Army liberated Czechoslovakia in 1945, Alexander Dubček was a man whose devotion to the cause had been forged in fire. He had paid for his beliefs with his own flesh and the life of his brother. When the Russian tanks rolled into Prague in 1945, seeing the red stars on their turrets didn't fill him with fear. It filled him with tears of gratitude. These were his brothers. These were the saviors. This was the man who began to climb the ladder of the Communist Party in the post-war years. But the Czechoslovakia he was helping to build was rapidly descending into a nightmare. Following the communist coup of 1948, the country entered a period of darkness that is difficult to imagine for those who did not live through it. It was the era of the Great Fear. The new regime, desperate to prove its loyalty to Stalin, unleashed a wave of terror that severed the spine of the nation. It wasn't just about political control. It was a psychological assault. A massive statue of Stalin was erected on Letná Hill in Prague, the largest representation of the dictator on the planet. It was a monstrosity of granite that loomed over the city, a constant stone-faced reminder that Big Brother was watching. The statue was so heavy that the hill itself had to be reinforced with concrete pillars to prevent a landslide, a perfect metaphor for a regime that could only be sustained by brute artificial force. Under the shadow of that statue, the show trials began. Men who had fought against the Nazis, loyal communists, and heroes of the resistance were dragged into courtrooms, forced to memorize scripts of confession, and then hanged. The most infamous was the trial of Rudolf Slansky, the party's own general secretary. The radio broadcast the proceedings, and the entire nation was forced to listen as broken men admitted to crimes they had never committed. The message was clear. No one is safe. Loyalty is not enough. Truth is irrelevant. In this atmosphere of gray terror, Alexander Dubček survived. He survived because he was quiet. He survived because he was charming. But mostly he survived because he was viewed as safe. The hardliners in Prague and the overseers in Moscow looked at his file and saw the perfect apparatchik. He was the boy from Kyrgyzstan. He was the war hero. He was unthreatening. He rose through the ranks in Slovakia, far from the viper's nest of Prague, gaining a reputation as a decent man in an indecent system. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the terror subsided, but it was replaced by something almost as soul-crushing: stagnation. The sheer boredom of totalitarianism. The country was run by Antonin Novotny, a hardliner with a face like cold dough and a personality to match. Novotny was a relic, a man who believed that if you simply arrested enough people and printed enough slogans, the economy would work. It didn't. By the mid-1960s, Czechoslovakia, once the industrial powerhouse of Central Europe, was rotting. The central planning system had become a farce. Factories churned out products that nobody wanted, mountains of heavy machinery that rusted in train yards, while ordinary citizens couldn't find toilet paper, sanitary pads, or decent razor blades. The shops were empty, the queues were long, and the mood was grim. There was an unspoken social contract in the Eastern Bloc. We pretend to work, and you pretend to pay us. But even that cynical deal was breaking down. The money was worthless, and there was nothing to buy with it anyway. Culturally, the country was being suffocated. Rock and roll was banned. Long hair on men was considered a political crime. Abstract art was labeled bourgeois decadence. But you cannot suppress the spirit of a nation forever. Pressure was building in the boiler, in smoky jazz clubs, in underground theaters, and in the student dormitories. A new generation was waking up. They didn't remember the war. They didn't care about the ideological battles of the past. They just wanted to live. They wanted to read books by Kafka. They wanted to listen to the Beatles. And they wanted to know why their country, which claimed to be a worker's paradise, felt more like a gray, crumbling prison. The spark, when it finally came, was absurdly mundane. It wasn't a grand political manifesto that ignited the powder keg. It was the plumbing. In late 1967, at the Strahov student dormitories in Prague, the living conditions were deplorable. The heating rarely worked, leaving students shivering in their coats while trying to study. The electricity was sporadic, constantly flickering and dying. On the night of October 31st, the lights went out again. Frustrated, cold, and tired of being ignored, the students did something unprecedented. They walked out. Hundreds of them marched from the dormitories toward the city center, holding candles in their hands. It was a peaceful, almost mournful procession. They didn't chant "down with communism." They didn't scream for the overthrow of the government. They chanted a simple, practical slogan: "We want light. We want light." It was a cry for electricity, but in the oppressive atmosphere of 1967, it became an instant, powerful metaphor. They wanted light in the darkness. They wanted truth. They wanted the gray fog to lift. The regime's response was a catastrophic error. Instead of fixing the fuses, they sent in the riot police. Students were beaten with truncheons. Tear gas filled the streets. The police chased teenagers into their dorm rooms and clubbed them. The brutality of the crackdown shocked the nation. Even within the Communist Party, the older generation was disgusted. Novotny, the hardline leader, dismissed the students as hooligans, but his time was running out. The beating of the students triggered a crisis within the party. The reformists, those who realized the economy was broken and the people were angry, saw their chance. They joined forces with the Slovak faction, who had long despised Novotny for his arrogance toward Slovakia. They needed a new leader. They needed someone who could calm the students, reassure the workers, and most importantly, someone who wouldn't terrify Moscow. They needed a compromise candidate, a face that represented change, but a history that screamed loyalty. They turned to Alexander Dubček. On January 5, 1968, the Central Committee voted to remove Novotny and install Dubček as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. It was a quiet palace coup. The public didn't celebrate immediately. They had seen leaders come and go, one gray suit replacing another. To them, Dubček was just another party official, perhaps slightly younger, perhaps slightly less grim, but a part of the machinery nonetheless. Even the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, signed off on the appointment with a shrug. Our Sasha, they called him in the Kremlin. They thought he was weak. They thought he was malleable. They thought that because he spoke their language and smiled at their jokes, he would be their puppet. They assumed that his Soviet childhood meant he would never, ever dream of defying them. It was the single greatest miscalculation in the history of the Cold War. Almost immediately, the atmosphere in Prague began to shift. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, confusing thaw. Dubček didn't behave like a first secretary. He refused the heavy security detail. He walked to work. On weekends, he went to professional football matches, sitting in the regular stands, eating sausages with mustard, cheering and groaning along with the factory workers. There is footage of him from this time at a public swimming pool, climbing onto the high diving board and performing a clumsy, joyful dive into the water, surfacing with a grin that seemed to say, "I am a human being. Are you?" This behavior was electrifying. For 20 years, the people had been ruled by statues in suits. Now they had a leader who sweated, laughed, and listened. In April 1968, Dubček and his team unveiled their master plan. It was called the action program. The title was dry, but the content was revolutionary. It proposed a separation of the party from the state. It called for freedom of assembly. It acknowledged the rights of socialist citizens to travel abroad, and crucially, it hinted at the end of censorship. Dubček coined a phrase to describe this vision, a phrase that would travel around the globe and define his legacy. He said he did not want to destroy socialism. He wanted to purify it. He wanted to build socialism with a human face. He believed with a tragic sincerity that this was what the Soviet Union wanted too. He believed that if he could just prove that freedom made the people work harder and love the party more, Moscow would applaud him. He thought he was saving communism from itself. As the spring sunshine finally broke through the winter clouds of 1968, the censorship system simply collapsed. It wasn't formally abolished at first. The censors just stopped working, and the journalists stopped listening to them. Suddenly, the newspapers were full of real news. Literarny Listy, the Writers' Union Weekly, began publishing articles that dissected the crimes of the 1950s. They interviewed victims of the purges. They asked hard questions about the economy. The television stations began broadcasting live, uncensored debates. People sat in their living rooms, jaws dropped, watching politicians being grilled by students. The fear that had paralyzed the nation for 2 decades evaporated. It was a euphoric, chaotic, beautiful release. We call it the Prague Spring, but it felt more like a national resurrection. Dubček's popularity skyrocketed to 78%. He was no longer just a politician. He was the symbol of a nation reclaiming its soul. He was the man who had opened the windows. But in the euphoria of the moment, amidst the jazz concerts and the philosophical debates in the cafes, Dubček and his supporters failed to see the storm gathering on the horizon. They were looking at the smiling faces of their own people. They should have been looking at the maps in the Kremlin. For Leonid Brezhnev and the Soviet Politburo, the Prague Spring was not a resurrection. It was a contagion. They watched the uncensored broadcasts from Prague with mounting horror. They saw young men with long hair criticizing the party. They saw articles questioning the Soviet alliance. To them, this wasn't reform. It was a counter-revolution. It was a virus. And if they didn't kill it in Prague, they knew it would spread to Warsaw, to Budapest, to East Berlin, and eventually to Moscow itself. The phone calls from the Kremlin began. At first, they were polite. "Sasha," Brezhnev would say, his voice heavy with paternal disappointment. "The media is out of control. You must rein them in. You are letting the reactionaries take over." Dubček would hold the receiver, sweating, trying to explain. "No, Leonid Ilyich, you don't understand," he would plead, his voice earnest. "The people are with us. The party is more popular than ever. We are building a stronger socialism." He was speaking the language of the future. Brezhnev was listening with the ears of the past. Dubček thought he was having a debate between friends. He didn't realize he was being put on trial. He didn't realize that in the eyes of the Soviet Empire, his human face was the face of an enemy. The spring of 1968 did not merely turn into summer. It ripened into a season of dangerous, intoxicating delirium. By June, the air in Prague was electric, charged with a kind of manic energy that comes when a prisoner realizes the cell door has been left unlocked. The action program had been the key, but the people were no longer waiting for Alexander Dubček to turn it. They were kicking the door open themselves. On June 27, 1968, the situation shifted from a government-led reform to a full-scale civic awakening. It happened with the publication of a manifesto titled The 2,000 Words. It was written by Ludvík Vakulík, a brilliant acerbic writer who possessed the kind of moral clarity that makes politicians nervous. The manifesto was published in 4 major newspapers simultaneously, landing on breakfast tables across the country like a grenade wrapped in newsprint. The 2,000 words was not a diplomatic document. It did not speak in the wooden tongue of the party bureaucracy. It was a direct, passionate appeal to the people. It bypassed the government entirely. It warned that the democratization process was fragile, that the old guard was still waiting in the shadows to take power back. It called on ordinary citizens, workers, farmers, scientists, and artists to take the initiative. Demand the resignation of those who abuse their power, it urged. It suggested strikes, boycotts, and public shaming of the corrupt. It ended with a promise that if foreign powers tried to intervene, the people would stand their ground, armed if necessary. For the Czech and Slovak public, it was a clarion call. Thousands of signatures poured in. It was the ultimate expression of the human face, citizens taking responsibility for their own fate. But in Moscow, the 2,000 words was read very differently. Leonid Brezhnev did not see a call for civic responsibility. He saw a manifesto for counter-revolution. He saw the specter of 1956 in Hungary, where communists were hanged from lampposts. The phrase, "armed if necessary," leaped off the page, confirming his darkest paranoia. This was no longer about Dubček tweaking the economy. This was the party losing control of the street. To the Kremlin, this document was proof that Dubček was either a traitor or a fool who was being swept away by forces he could not comprehend. The phone lines between Moscow and Prague began to burn. Brezhnev demanded that Dubček condemn the manifesto. He demanded that the signatories be punished. And here, Dubček made a choice that sealed his fate. He criticized the document. Yes, he called it politically unwise, but he refused to ban it. He refused to arrest Vakulik. He refused to unleash the police. He told Brezhnev, with that maddeningly gentle stubbornness, that in a socialist democracy people had the right to express their opinions. He believed that the party had to win the argument, not silence it. It was a noble stance, it was a moral stance, and in the brutal calculus of the Cold War, it was a suicidal stance. The pressure began to mount, not just from Moscow, but from all sides. The leaders of the other Warsaw Pact nations, Walter Ulbricht in East Germany, Władysław Gomułka in Poland, János Kadar in Hungary, were watching Prague with growing panic. They were terrified. If the Czechs could have a free press, why not the Poles? If the Slovaks could travel to Vienna, why not the East Germans? They saw the Prague Spring as a fire in a neighbor's house that was threatening to burn down their own roofs. They began to bombard Brezhnev with demands. Do something. Stop him. Cut out the cancer before it spreads. In July, the Soviet Union summoned the leadership of the Warsaw Pact to a summit in Warsaw. They invited everyone, except Czechoslovakia. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. It was a trial in absentia. While Dubček sat in Prague, wondering why his friends were ghosting him, the leaders of the 5 fraternal nations sat in a room in Poland and drafted a letter. It became known as the Warsaw Letter. It was an ultimatum disguised as a diplomatic note. It stated in cold, unambiguous terms that the situation in Czechoslovakia was no longer purely your internal affair. It declared that the defense of socialism was the collective duty of all Warsaw Pact countries. Translated from diplomatic speak, it meant, we own you, and we are coming to collect. When Dubček received the letter, he was shaken, but he still clung to his optimism. He believed that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He believed that if he could just look Brezhnev in the eye face to face without the other hardliners present, he could fix it. He requested a bilateral meeting. The Soviets agreed, but they set the stage for a psychological showdown. They chose the location, Černá nad Tisou. It was a tiny, dusty railway junction on the border between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. It was nowhere, a place of steel tracks, gravel, and oppressive heat. The meeting was scheduled for late July. The symbolism was stark. The Soviets would not come to Prague, and Dubček refused to go to Moscow. They would meet on the line, on the very edge of the empire. The drama that unfolded at Černá nad Tisou between July 29th and August 1st was worthy of Shakespeare. It was a clash of two worlds. Dubček and the Czechoslovak delegation arrived by train from the west. Brezhnev and the massive Soviet delegation arrived by train from the east. The talks were held in a local cultural center, a nondescript building that quickly became a pressure cooker. The air conditioning failed. The windows had to be opened, letting in the noise of the shunting trains and the swarms of summer flies. Inside, the temperature, both physical and political, was unbearable. Brezhnev did not come to negotiate, he came to bully. For 4 days, the Soviet delegation hammered the Czechs. They shouted, they threatened. They accused Dubček of being a traitor to the working class. They read out lists of counter-revolutionary journalists who had to be fired. They demanded the restoration of censorship. They demanded the permanent stationing of Soviet troops on the Czech border to protect them from the West. Dubček, exhausted and sweating in his suit, held his ground. But it was a strange, passive resistance. He didn't shout back. He repeated his mantra. We are loyal, we are socialist, but we must do it our way. He fell ill during the negotiations, at one point needing medical attention, his body physically rebelling against the stress. The psychological warfare was intense. At one point, the Soviet delegation simply stood up and walked out, threatening to leave and take the train back to Moscow, a move that would have signaled an immediate invasion. Dubček had to chase after them, pleading, begging them to return to the table. In the end, a compromise was reached, or so Dubček thought. He agreed to curb the excesses of the press. He agreed to reinforce the role of the party. In exchange, Brezhnev promised that the Soviet troops who had been in Czechoslovakia for maneuvers since June would finally leave. He promised that the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia would be respected. The conference ended with a public display of unity that was grotesque in its falsity. On the station platform, amidst the steam of the locomotives, Brezhnev turned to Dubček. He opened his arms. He embraced him. He kissed him. It was the kiss of the Godfather. Dubček returned to Prague triumphant. He stepped off the train in Bratislava to a hero's welcome. He told the crowds, "We have been successful. We will continue our path." He truly believed he had bought his country time. He believed he had threaded the needle. He thought the Warsaw Letter had been torn up. He did not know that while he was hugging Brezhnev on the platform, the Soviet generals were already finalizing the invasion maps. He did not know that the compromise was merely a stalling tactic to allow the Soviet military to get its logistics in place. August arrived, the height of the summer holidays. Prague emptied out as people went to their country cottages. The mood was relaxed. The tension of July seemed to have broken. The Soviet troops were seen leaving. The crisis, it seemed, was over. Dubček, exhausted by the months of stress, decided to take a few days off. He stayed in Prague but slowed his pace. He spent time with his family. He walked in the woods. He felt a profound sense of relief. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked. But the abyss had not blinked. It was merely waiting for him to close his eyes. Throughout the first weeks of August, the deception continued. Brezhnev called Dubček on the phone, chatting about minor details, keeping up the charade of the concerned friend. Meanwhile, the KGB was active in Prague. Agents were infiltrating the ministries. They were preparing lists of people to be arrested. They were securing the airport protocols. They were planting evidence of a Western plot, stashes of American weapons, which were actually old German guns from World War II packed in U.S.-marked crates by the KGB, were discovered near the border to justify the coming intervention. On August 17th, the Soviet Politburo met in a secret session in Moscow. The decision was made. The soft option had failed. Dubček was not controlling the situation. He was riding a tiger. The risk of the virus spreading to Poland and East Germany was too high. The Brezhnev Doctrine was born. When forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country towards capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries. In other words, sovereignty is a myth. You are free only as long as you do exactly what we say. The date was set. Operation Danube, August 20th. In Prague, the weekend of August 17th to 18th was beautiful. The sun shone on the Vltava River. Young couples walked hand in hand across the Charles Bridge. The cafes were full. There was a sense of laziness, of a summer winding down. On Tuesday, August 20th, the Presidium of the Communist Party met at 2 p.m. It was a routine meeting. Dubček presided. He was tired but in good spirits. They discussed economic reports. They argued about the upcoming party congress scheduled for September, a congress that Dubček believed would solidify his reforms and remove the last of the hardliners. As the afternoon turned into evening, the meeting dragged on. Outside, the sun set, casting long shadows over the city. The streetlights flickered on. People went home to their dinners, to their televisions, to their beds. They tucked their children in, safe in the knowledge that the world was stable, that the Russians had gone home, that the human face was here to stay. He sat there, debating the wording of a resolution, believing in the power of words, while steel and fire were rolling toward him from every point on the compass. The betrayal was already in motion, silent and deadly as a rising tide, and the man who had smiled at the world was about to learn that a smile is no defense against a tank. We return now to that room in Prague, just before midnight on August 20th. While Dubček sat adjusting his tie, believing the crisis had passed, the machinery of betrayal was already in motion. He had no idea that while he debated party statutes, a Soviet Antonov 24-passenger plane was requesting an emergency landing at Ruzyně International Airport. It was a Trojan horse. As the plane taxied, Soviet special forces poured onto the tarmac, seizing the control tower in minutes. The silence in Dubček's office was not peace. It was the calm before the execution. And then, at 11:40 p.m., the phone rang, the sharp, mechanical sound we heard at the beginning of this story. When Prime Minister Chernik hung up the receiver and whispered that the armies were crossing the borders, the psychological shock was total. Joseph Smirkovsky sat frozen, but Dubček simply collapsed inward. He realized he had clung to a piece of paper like a shield, only to find it was just paper. But amidst the shock, a critical decision had to be made. The Czechoslovak People's Army was well-trained, well-equipped, and standing by in their barracks waiting for orders. If Dubček gave the word, Europe would be plunged into a bloodbath, a suicidal conflict against overwhelming odds that would leave Prague a smoking ruin, like Budapest in 1956. Dubček looked at his colleagues, thought of the young men in the barracks and the families sleeping in the apartments below, and made the most controversial decision of his life. He ordered that they must not shed blood, that there was no hope of defense, and that the army must remain in the barracks. To some, it was high treason, a surrender without a fight. To others, it was the ultimate act of humanitarianism. The Presidium began to draft a proclamation to the people, a race against time to tell the nation what was happening, and to urge them not to fight before the Soviet troops reached the radio station. It was now 1 a.m., August 21st, and the city was waking up to a nightmare. The low rumble of heavy engines was vibrating through the cobblestones, and the first Soviet columns were reaching the suburbs. In the radio station on Vinohradska Street, the journalists were frantic as they received the text of the Presidium's proclamation condemning the invasion. The announcer began to read it over the airwaves, his voice trembling, addressing the entire people of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. People waking up in the middle of the night heard the words invasion and betrayal, and then, mid-sentence, the radio went dead. The Soviets had cut the transmitters. However, the underground network of the Prague Spring sprang into action. As the main transmitters died, smaller ones flickered to life, and the truth began to jump from frequency to frequency in a game of electronic cat and mouse that would continue for days. Back in the Central Committee building, the end was approaching. The building was undefended with no guards, only a few policemen at the door. Dubček and the other leaders sat in Dubček's office, waiting, making no attempt to run because the country was locked down. They sat around the table, smoking, listening for the footsteps in the corridor. At 4 a.m., a black Volga limousine screeched to a halt outside, followed by armored personnel carriers. Soviet paratroopers, wearing maroon berets and carrying submachine guns, kicked open the front doors, stormed the stairs, and cut the phone lines. The door to Dubček's office burst open, and a squad of soldiers rushed in, weapons raised, shouting in Russian for everyone to stay where they were. The leaders of Czechoslovakia, the legitimate government of a sovereign nation, were held at gunpoint in their own office by foreign troops. Then, KGB agents entered, men in gray suits who walked around the table ripping the phone cables out of the walls, a symbolic act of castration signifying that the leaders had no voice and no connection. Dubček sat still, looking at the young Russian soldiers and seeing the confusion in their eyes. These boys had been told they were fighting counter-revolutionaries and fascists, but instead they found a room full of tired, middle-aged men in suits. For hours they were held there as the sun began to rise over Prague. The golden light of the morning hit the Vltava River, illuminating a scene of surreal horror. Tanks were parked on Wenceslas Square, their barrels pointed at the National Museum, and the statues of saints on the Charles Bridge looked down on armored columns grinding the centuries-old stone to dust. The people of Prague were pouring into the streets, not hiding in their cellars, but coming out weeping, screaming, and shaking their fists. Yet they remembered Dubček's order and did not shoot. Instead, they attacked with the only weapons they had left, words and symbols. They climbed onto the tanks, knocked on the hatches, and when the confused Soviet tankers popped their heads out, they asked why they were there. Girls in miniskirts walked up to soldiers and placed carnations in the muzzles of their AK-47s, creating an image that would sear itself into the global consciousness. But the confusion of the soldiers on the street did not stop the machinery of the coup. At 9 a.m., the KGB agents in Dubček's office finally made their move. They ordered Dubček, Shmerkovsky, and Kriegel to stand up, shoved them into the hallway, and marched them down the stairs. Dubček was pushed into an armored personnel carrier, the hatch slamming shut and plunging him into darkness. He was driven through the streets of the city he loved, hearing only the muffled shouts of his people and the grinding of the gears. Taken to the airport, he was transferred to a Soviet military plane, separated from the others, and flown to Moscow. It was a journey into the underworld. Dubček was physically exhausted, emotionally shattered, and terrified, believing he was flying to his execution like Imre Nagy before him. When they landed in Moscow, there were no red carpets, only a car ride to a secret KGB dacha in the forests outside the city where he was locked in isolation. The psychological pressure was calibrated to break him. They deprived him of sleep and questioned him for hours, not about politics, but about his alleged crimes, trying to make him confess to being part of a Zionist imperialist plot. It was absurd that Dubček, the man who had grown up in the Soviet Union and loved Russians, was being told he was an agent of the West. The stress began to take a physical toll. He suffered heart palpitations and fainted, requiring Soviet doctors to inject him with unknown substances that fogged his mind and eroded his will. On August 23rd, he was taken to the Kremlin to face the men he had called friends. Brezhnev, Kosygin, Podgorny, and the entire Soviet Politburo were there, alongside Dubček's own colleagues who had been brought from their separate prisons. Brezhnev did not apologize or explain. He simply laid a document on the table known as the Moscow Protocol. The terms were absolute and devastating. The document demanded that the reforms must stop immediately. It required that censorship be fully re-established. It insisted that all counter-revolutionary organizations be banned. It declared that the decisions of the recent secret party Congress, which had condemned the invasion, must be annulled. And perhaps most painfully, it stated that Soviet troops would remain in Czechoslovakia temporarily, a word that would stretch for 23 years. Brezhnev looked at Dubček and told him to sign it, making the implication clear: sign and return to Prague as a hollow figurehead, or refuse and face likely death while the country drowned in blood. The trap was perfect. Brezhnev wanted Dubček to be the one to tell the people to surrender, using the face of the Prague Spring to usher in the Prague winter. Dubček initially refused, whispering that he could not betray his people. But the negotiations dragged on for 4 days of screaming threats and psychological torture. The Czech delegation began to break down, arguing that they had to save the nation from destruction, that they must live to fight another day. Only František Kriegel refused to sign, telling the Soviets to shoot him if they wished. But Dubček, the gentle and broken leader, convinced himself he had no choice. On August 26, 1968, Alexander Dubček picked up the pen, feeling the weight of the nib heavier than a tank, and signed his name. With that stroke of ink, the Prague Spring officially ended. The flight back to Prague on August 27th was a funeral procession in the sky. Dubček sat in silence, the signed protocol in his briefcase burning a hole in his conscience, knowing he was bringing chains to a people who were still painting his name on walls. When he landed, he was whisked to the castle to address the nation. The microphones were set up and the red light went on. He began to speak, but he couldn't. He gasped for air, and long, agonizing pauses filled the broadcast. The listeners could hear him weeping, the sound of a man struggling to breathe under the weight of his shame. When he finally stammered that they had arrived at an agreement to normalize the situation, the people realized with sinking horror that the dream was over. Dubček remained in office technically, but he was a dead man walking. The Soviets used him to pacify the crowds and dismantle the resistance, slice by slice. He fired reformist ministers, restricted the press, and banned public gatherings, destroying his own creation to prevent the worst. The resistance flared one last time in January 1969, when Jan Palach, a 20-year-old student, set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square, becoming a human torch to shock the nation out of its lethargy. Dubček wept at the hospital, but he was powerless. In April 1969, 8 months after the invasion, the Central Committee met again and voted to remove Dubček as first secretary, replacing him with Gustav Husak, a man who believed in power and obedience. Husak began the era of normalization, a gray suffocating blanket that descended on the country. Dubček's fall was slow and humiliating. First given a ceremonial role as chairman of the Federal Assembly, he was then sent to Turkey as an ambassador in 1970, a polite exile, but even that was too much dignity for the Soviets. In June 1970, he was recalled, expelled from the Communist Party, and stripped of his status. He was sent back to Bratislava and assigned a job in the Forestry Commission. For the next 19 years, Alexander Dubček worked in a lumber yard, sitting in a small drafty office, managing the inventory of chainsaws and overalls. He ate his lunch from a tin box, alone. The secret police set up a permanent observation post outside his house, following him everywhere, bugging his phone, and harassing his children. He became a ghost in his own life, a living monument to failure. While the world moved on and the Prague Spring became a footnote, Dubček grew old among the trees, writing his memoirs in secret and titling them Hope Dies Last. He waited with the patience of a forester, watching the saplings grow and knowing that eventually even the mightiest oak will rot if the roots are poisoned. The years that followed Alexander Dubček's expulsion from the Communist Party were defined by a silence so heavy it seemed to possess a physical weight. The regime of Gustav Husak, installed by Soviet tanks, did not need to build new concentration camps to punish the nation. Instead, they turned the entire country into a waiting room. This era, known as normalization, was a masterclass in bureaucratic soul-crushing. It was a time when the color was drained from public life, replaced by a pervasive, obligatory grayness. For the average citizen, survival meant retreating inward, focusing on their country cottages, their cars, and their families, while publicly mouthing slogans they did not believe. But for Dubček, there was no retreat. He was the living, breathing ghost of what might have been, and the regime was determined to make his existence a daily humiliation. His assignment to the West Slovak State Forest Administration in Bratislava was not merely a demotion, it was a calculated insult designed to break his spirit. The man who had negotiated with presidents and debated the future of socialism was now responsible for the maintenance of chainsaws, the allocation of work gloves, and the inventory of timber. His office was a small drab room that smelled of sawdust and stale tobacco. His colleagues were polite but terrified. To be seen speaking with Alexander Dubček was to risk one's own career. So he often ate alone, a solitary figure in blue overalls, surrounded by the noise of machinery but wrapped in a cocoon of isolation. Yet he performed his duties with a quiet, stubborn dignity. He did not complain. He did not sabotage the work. He simply did the job, arriving on time and leaving on time, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. The STB, the Czechoslovak secret police, did not leave him to the trees. They set up a permanent observation post directly across the street from his modest villa in Bratislava. It was a brazen display of power. They did not hide. They wanted him to know they were watching. A white Tatra 603, the signature car of the secret police, trailed him everywhere. If he went to the cemetery to visit his parents' graves, the Tatra was there. If he went to the shops to buy bread, men in leather coats stood in the aisle watching him choose a loaf. They harassed his wife, Anna, a gentle woman who suffered deeply under the strain. They blocked his sons' careers, preventing them from attending university or holding decent jobs. It was a strategy of suffocation intended to provoke him into a rash action that would justify an arrest or simply to drive him into a grave of stress and despair. Throughout the 1970s, while Dubček worked in the lumberyard, a different kind of resistance began to form in the shadows of Prague. It was led not by reformed communists, but by intellectuals, writers, and playwrights, men like Václav Havel. In 1977, they published Charter 77, a manifesto calling on the government to respect human rights. Interestingly, Dubček did not sign it. This absence speaks volumes about the complex internal politics of the opposition. Dubček still considered himself a communist, a believer in the true humanistic potential of the ideology. The dissidents of Charter 77, however, had moved beyond communism entirely. They saw the whole system as rotten. There was a painful distance between the fallen angel of 1968 and the new enemies of the state. Dubček was a symbol of the past, a reminder of a failed hope, while Havel was the voice of a new, uncompromising moral clarity. So Dubček remained alone, suspended between the party that hated him and the dissidents who didn't quite know what to do with him. But history has a sense of irony that no novelist could invent. In 1985, a new leader ascended to power in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was young, energetic, and he spoke of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. As the world listened to Gorbachev's speeches, the people of Czechoslovakia looked at each other with a mixture of shock and dark humor. Gorbachev's reforms sounded almost exactly like Dubček's action program of 1968. The very ideas that had brought Soviet tanks into Prague were now being preached from Moscow. A popular joke began to circulate in the bars of Prague. What is the difference between Dubček and Gorbachev? The answer, 19 years. For Dubček, watching from his forestry office, this must have been a moment of profound vindication, mixed with bitter regret. The man who had crushed his dream, Brezhnev, was dead. The empire was admitting that the Prague Spring had been right all along. Emboldened by the winds of change blowing from Moscow, Dubček began to tentatively step back into the light. In 1988, the Italian University of Bologna offered him an honorary doctorate. In a surprising move, the Czechoslovak authorities, perhaps sensing the shifting tides or simply not wanting to cause an international incident, allowed him to travel. It was his first trip to the West in 2 decades. When he arrived in Italy, the reception was overwhelming. He was not treated as a forgotten forestry clerk. He was greeted as a hero of European history. He gave interviews. He spoke on the radio. His voice, silent for so long, was suddenly heard again in living rooms across Europe. He did not call for the overthrow of communism. True to his nature, he called for its reform. He still believed that the system could be saved if it returned to the principles of 1968. He returned to Bratislava energized, sensing that the ice was finally cracking. He was right. The year 1989 arrived like a hurricane. Poland held free elections. The Berlin Wall crumbled in November, an event that was televised globally, shattering the psychological barrier of the Iron Curtain. The dominoes were falling and everyone knew Czechoslovakia was next. The atmosphere in Prague became electric. The fear that had paralyzed the nation for 20 years began to evaporate, replaced by a nervous, adrenaline-fueled anticipation. Students began to organize. Actors began to hold meetings in theaters. The gray zone, the silent majority, began to wake up. On November 17, 1989, a student march in Prague to commemorate the death of Jan Opletal, a student killed by the Nazis, turned into a massive protest against the communist regime. The marchers, thousands strong, headed toward Wenceslas Square. On Narodny Street, they were met by riot police. The white helmets blocked the street, trapping the students. Then they attacked. It was a brutal beating. Young girls were clubbed to the ground. Students were kicked and dragged into police vans. But this time, the violence did not work. Instead of terrifying the population, it enraged them. The rumors spread that a student had been killed, a false rumor created by a provocateur, but effective nonetheless. The next day, the theaters went on strike. The universities went on occupation strike. The Velvet Revolution had begun. Alexander Dubček was in Bratislava when the news broke. He immediately got into his car and drove to Prague. The journey must have felt like a closing of the circle. The last time he had made such a journey, he was returning from Moscow in chains. Now, he was driving toward a revolution. On November 24th, 1989, the magic moment occurred. Wenceslas Square was packed with 300,000 people. The air was freezing, but the crowd was warm, pressed together in a sea of bodies, waving flags and jingling their keys, a symbol that it was time for the communists to ring the bell and leave. The epicenter of the revolution was the balcony of the Melanchthonic publishing house overlooking the square. From this balcony, Václav Havel and the Civic Forum were directing the protests. Then, the doors to the balcony opened and a figure stepped out. He was older now. His hair was white. He wore a heavy winter coat, but the smile was unmistakable. A roar went up from the crowd that shook the windows of the National Museum. Dubček, Dubček, Dubček. It was a thunderclap of emotion. For the older generation in the crowd, seeing him was like seeing a ghost return to life. He represented their stolen youth, their broken dreams, and now their redemption. For the younger students, he was a legend from the history books made flesh. Dubček stood by the microphone, tears streaming down his face. He opened his arms to the people who had never forgotten him. "My dear fellow citizens," he began, his voice trembling with the same raw emotion that had defined his radio address in 1968. But this time, the tears were not of sorrow. The light has finally returned. Moments later, Václav Havel stepped up beside him. The two men embraced. It was an image of powerful symbolism. Dubček, the face of socialism with a human face, and Havel, the face of liberal democracy, standing together. The crowd chanted Dubček na hrad, Dubček to the castle, meaning they wanted him as president. In that euphoric instant, it seemed that the circle was complete, that the hero of 1968 would naturally resume his rightful place as the leader of the nation. But revolutions move faster than men. Behind the scenes in the smoke-filled rooms of the Magic Lantern Theater where the Civic Forum strategized, a difficult political reality was taking shape. The students and the dissidents loved Dubček as a symbol, but they were wary of him as a politician. He was still a socialist. He still spoke of reforming the party. But the country didn't want reform anymore. It wanted a funeral for communism. They wanted capitalism. They wanted the West. They wanted a complete break from the past. Havel represented that break. Dubček represented a bridge to a past that, while noble, was obsolete. In the frantic days of December 1989, a deal was struck. It was a compromise, gentle but firm. Václav Havel would become the President of the Republic, the moral and political head of the new state. Alexander Dubček would become the chairman of the Federal Assembly, the Speaker of the Parliament. It was a high honor, the second highest post in the land, but it was largely ceremonial. Dubček accepted it. He was not a power-hungry man. He wanted to serve his country, and if serving meant stepping aside for the new generation, he would do it. On December the 29th, 1989, in the Vladislav Hall of the Prague Castle, under the high Gothic arches, Alexander Dubček was voted in as chairman of the assembly. Minutes later, he presided over the vote that made Václav Havel president. The transformation was complete. The non-person was now the second most powerful man in a free country. The man from the Forestry Commission was receiving standing ovations from the world. However, the fairy tale ending was deceptive. The years following the Velvet Revolution were not easy for Dubček. He found himself in a strange political wilderness once again. As the parliament debated the dismantling of the socialist economy, Dubček often found himself the odd man out. He argued for a slower transition, for a social safety net, for the preservation of certain socialist ideals. He worried about the unchecked rise of capitalism, about the poor, about the workers. To the new, aggressive free market ministers, like Václav Klaus, Dubček was a dinosaur. They respected his suffering, but they rolled their eyes at his politics. He was a man out of time, trying to apply the solutions of 1968 to the problems of the 1990s. Furthermore, the state itself was fracturing. The tension between Czechs and Slovaks, suppressed for decades by the communist lid, boiled over. The Slovaks felt ignored by Prague. The Czechs felt dragged down by Slovakia. Dubček, a Slovak who was beloved in Prague, tried desperately to hold the federation together. He traveled back and forth between the two capitals, pleading for unity. He believed deeply in the Czechoslovak idea, but just as he had failed to stop the Soviet tanks with words, he found he could not stop the forces of nationalism with sentiment. The country was drifting toward a velvet divorce. In the midst of this political turmoil, tragedy struck. It was September 1st, 1992. The summer was fading, the days growing shorter. Dubček was traveling from Bratislava to Prague for a session of the Federal Assembly. He was being driven in a government BMW 535 i. The weather was horrific. Rain lashed the D1 highway, turning the road into a slick gray ribbon. Near the town of Humpolek, at kilometer marker 88, the car hit a patch of standing water. The vehicle was traveling at high speed, estimated at over 130 kilometers per hour. It aquaplaned. The driver lost control. The heavy BMW skidded sideways, flew off the highway, crashed through a barrier, and tumbled down a steep ravine. It rolled multiple times, a violent, chaotic disintegration of metal and glass. Dubček, who was sitting in the back seat and reportedly not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown through the rear window. He landed nearly 20 meters away from the wreckage, lying in the wet grass, his body shattered. When rescuers arrived, they found him conscious but in agony. His spine was fractured, his chest crushed. He was rushed to a hospital in Prague. For the next 2 months, the man who had survived the Gestapo, the Soviet invasion, the KGB kidnapping, and 20 years of silence, fought his final battle. He underwent multiple surgeries. There were moments of hope, days when he could speak to his family, when that famous smile would flicker briefly across his face. But his injuries were too severe for a man of 70 years. Complications set in. His kidneys failed. His heart gave out. On November 7, 1992, Alexander Dubček died. The timing of his death was laden with a final bitter irony. He died less than 2 months before Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. He died on the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the very revolution that had birthed the ideology he had spent his life trying to humanize. He did not live to see his country split in two. He left the world just as the map was being redrawn one last time. His death left a void that was filled with questions. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories began to swirl. Was it really an accident? Why was the car traveling so fast in such bad weather? Why was his briefcase, which supposedly contained sensitive testimony he was about to give regarding KGB crimes, never found at the scene? Some speculated that the remaining elements of the KGB, or perhaps even hardliners, within the new Czech establishment who wanted to silence his testimony on the past, had sabotaged the car. Investigations were launched. The driver was eventually convicted of negligence, but no evidence of foul play was ever definitively found. It remains one of those historical question marks, a fog that clings to the end of his life just as the fog of politics clung to his career. But the manner of his death cannot overshadow the monumental arc of his life. As thousands gathered for his funeral, walking behind the hearse in the freezing Bratislava wind, they were not just burying a politician. They were burying the last romantic of the Cold War. Alexander Dubček's death was not merely the end of a man. It was the final melancholy chord of a symphony that had been interrupted 24 years earlier. When the earth closed over his coffin in the Slavice Udali cemetery in Bratislava, it sealed away the last tangible link to the dream of 1968. But as the dirt settled, the questions that his life provoked did not disappear. They rose like ghosts, hovering over the newly formed nations of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, demanding answers that history, in its cold indifference, has refused to provide. In the rushed optimism of the 1990s, the world wanted morally absolute heroes like Václav Havel, Dubček, the man who compromised, the man who signed the Moscow Protocol to save his people from slaughter, was seen by many as a relic, an awkward reminder of a past best forgotten. There was no Nuremberg trial for the betrayal of 1968. The villains died in their beds, and the hero died in a rainy ditch. Yet history is not a fairy tale. Alexander Dubček's legacy is not found in the victory of a battle, but in the dignity of his defeat. He faced an impossible choice in the Kremlin: die as a martyr and let his country burn, or live in shame to shield his people. He chose the heavier burden. He chose to live. Today, the details of the treaties fade, but the image remains. The man who smiled at tanks, the forester who waited among the trees, the leader who proved that even in the darkest winter of totalitarianism, the human spirit could still dream of spring. Dubček wrote that hope dies last. He was right. The tanks could crush the reforms, and a twisted wreck of steel could crush his body, but they could never quite crush the memory of his humanity. We are left with the haunting suspicion that in the long, dark calculus of history, it is better to be the man who tried to humanize the machine and failed than the man who never tried at all. The forest has reclaimed the forester. The silence has reclaimed the voice. But the spring remains.